Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this briefing on the National Wildlife Refuge System. This briefing is hosted by the Cooperative Alliance for Refuge Enhancement, or CARE, in partnership with the Congressional Wildlife Refuge Caucus and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm Libby Marking. I'm the Director of Government Affairs for the National Wildlife Refuge Association, and I am chair of CARE, and I'll be moderating for us today. And I'd also like to thank our panelists for joining us as well. We have Cynthia Martinez, Chief of the National Wildlife Refuge System, Christian Hunt, Senior Policy Analyst for Federal Lands at Defenders of Wildlife, Ian Nakayama, Government Relations Manager at the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. And we're also joined by Brian Neeser. He is a fellow from Congressman Mike Thompson's office, and he's here representing the Congressional Wildlife Refuge Caucus. Congressman Thompson is one of the longtime co-chairs of that caucus. And so together they will be providing information about the refuge system's contributions to biodiversity, nature-based climate solutions, wildlife-dependent recreation and outdoor access, and community-driven economies. And importantly, the role that Congress has in supporting refuges around the country. So some really quick housekeeping before we move into the presentations. We expect this briefing to be about an hour long, and we'll have 10 minutes left at the end for any Q&A. So if you have any questions throughout these presentations, please just submit them using the Q&A function through Zoom, and I will be able to see those questions come in. And this briefing is also being recorded, so this will be put out on the Refuge Association's website, YouTube afterwards, and it will be sent out to all the attendees afterwards, along with some additional just follow-up, things like fact sheets, things like that. All right, so moving into the presentations, first I just wanted to give a bit of background about the Cooperative Alliance for Refuge Enhancement. So we are a coalition of 23 wildlife, sporting, scientific, and conservation organizations that span the political spectrum. And we represent over 16 million Americans who value outdoor recreation and wildlife conservation. So we're a very diverse coalition, and I will show you the list of organizations we have in the coalition in the slide after this one. So we represent a bunch of different types of constituencies that have a stake in the health of the refuge system. So we were created in 1995 to bring together all of these different types of groups around our shared values and our love of wildlife. And our main purpose is just to advocate for increased funding for the National Wildlife Refuge System. So these are the groups that we currently have in the CARE coalition. As you can see, it's very diverse. And like I said, I will be sending this recording out afterwards. But you can also see additional information about CARE on our website, which is fundwildliferefuges.com. So as I said, the main purpose of our coalition is to advocate for increased funding. So in FY25, we are urging Congress to allocate at least $602.3 million in funding for the refuge system. This is equivalent to the president's budget request. And this is just really a much needed increase over FY24 levels, which I believe one of the panelists here will be getting into the kind of funding history for the refuge system. But while that is our ask, we're asking for at least that amount, we also recognize that the true need for the refuge system is much, much more, somewhere around the tune of $2.2 billion. And that is just to actually effectively and sufficiently manage the lands that are there, meet its basic needs, meet the mandates that it has in the public demand, and ensure that there's enough staff to maintain these lands properly. So that is our ask for FY25. And I will be sending out additional information with the background for that ask and the justification after to all the attendees after this webinar. All right, so I will pass it on to Brian, who's representing the Congressional Wildlife Refuge Caucus, to give a bit about background about the purpose of the caucus.
Great, thanks, Libby, and hello, everyone. Just wanted to start off today by saying that Congressman Thompson does regret not being able to be here today. He had a scheduling conflict and he couldn't make it, but he wanted me to send his regards and express his appreciation for the hard work and support from all of you who are dedicated to the important mission of improving wildlife refuges. And he also wanted to say thank those of you who've joined just because you're interested in learning more. So yeah, I'm going to give a brief description of the caucus and the work that we do to further the mission of improving the National Wildlife Refuge System. So the Congressional Wildlife Caucus was established in 2006, and the goal of the caucus is to improve collaboration among congressional members and staff that have an interest in supporting the National Wildlife Refuge System. And the idea is that we want to build a momentum around important issues and leverage that into action. And so how do we do that? Well, in Congress, mostly we do that with money and laws. So, you know, we work to make sure. So is my video glitching for folks?
It is, but we can hear you.
You know, I can maybe try and just, that's crazy. Let's see if I can stop my video. I don't know if that's going to drop me from the call.
You're fine.
Okay, it resolved itself.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. That was distracting. Okay, so here we go again. Anyways, just power through. So yeah, the goal is to make sure that the refuge system is adequately funded at levels that, you know, not only allow for baseline maintenance and upkeep, but we want to also continue to expand the footprint of the refuge system as a whole. And another important goal is to educate members of Congress and their staff about the refuge system and existing and foreseeable challenges. And you know, with as much turnover as there is on the Hill, the caucus is also an important tool that helps to ensure that, you know, the knowledge base that we develop is preserved and the issues that we identify and work on stay sort of on the front burner year after year through subsequent Congresses. I'm so tempted to hit stop my video, but I think that might drop me from the call. Okay, so I think I might have a solution if you just bear with me 1 second. Oh, that's not it either. Okay. So, you know, like so many other important programs in Congress, the, you know, money is at the heart of the actions that we can take to maintain and expand the wildlife refuge system. One of the ways that us non-appropriations staff support this funding is through leading appropriations letters. Basically, we write, you know, letters to the Appropriations Committee requesting that they recognize our funding priorities, and then we try to get as many members to sign on to those as possible to say, look, you know, there's all this support for these issues. Please take that into account when you are developing your appropriations bills. So two of the you know, important programs that fund the wildlife refuge system are the Land and Water Conservation Fund and the North American Wetlands Conservation Act program. So the Land and Water Conservation Fund, LWCF, was established in 1964, and we are claiming that it's America's most successful conservation program. I don't know if other folks would have an issue with that, but you know, this is our show, so we're just going to make that claim and stick with it. It has funded 45,000 outdoor recreation opportunities in every state and every county across the country. And it does that by designating and protecting wildlife refuges, in addition to funding the expansion and maintenance of national parks, national forests, other land, from anything from baseball fields to battlefields. And so where does that money come from? In the 116 Congress, they voted to permanently authorize funding for the LWCF, and they also ended up taking it a step further, and they voted to permanently fund it at $900 million a year. So it no longer has to go through that typical appropriations process. And so what happens with that money is that it ends up getting split up between BLM, National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, and other state and local programs. And I included a list of the co-leads for the letter. You know, I'm not going to read them all out in the interest of time, but just wanted to say thanks to all of you and your bosses for this support, for your support with this very successful letter and program. Another important and successful program that my boss leads, co-leads, is the North American Wetlands Conservation Act, or NACA. And this is a sort of unique public-private partnership program that matches federal and non-federal funds for the protection of wetlands and migratory bird habitat. NACA it's also a very successful and widely supported and also very bipartisan program that has funded over 3,300 projects and has conserved almost 32 million acres of wetlands and uplands. And that number goes up every year. So I'm sure they're going to surpass that 32 million figure pretty soon. And again, NACA accomplishes this mission by providing funds that are used to purchase lands and easements and make improvements to access and wildlife habitat, much of which is within wildlife refuges. So, I've mentioned a couple times the idea of growth of the wildlife refuge footprint. And so another way that happens is through the Migratory Bird Conservation Commission. The commission was established in 1929 by the Migratory Bird Conservation Act, and the commission meets twice per year in the spring and fall. One of their main functions is to approve purchasing and easements, or they approve the purchasing and easements of land rights for areas that are recommended by the Secretary of Interior. And it's mainly funded by duck stamps, which is basically your bird hunting licenses, and then guns and ammunition taxes. And the MBCC, it was since it was established, Fish and Wildlife Service has acquired over 6 million acres of lands and wetlands. More recently, in 2023, there were 6 different wildlife refuge projects that were expanded, and in 2024, there were 2 additional expansions, and we still have another meeting coming up in the fall, so there will probably be more this year. So keep an eye on that. And it's also worth mentioning that the NBCC approves NACA project funding as well. So, aside from the money side of things, caucus members can also support the refuge system through legislation, obviously. So some examples of what we've done and what we do. Every year, the caucus co-chairs, they introduce a resolution that designates the second week of October as National Wildlife Refuge Week. So go ahead and mark your calendars now. There has also been some recent legislation. In 2022, the co-chairs co-sponsored the Keep America's Refuges Operational Act, which essentially just reauthorized a number of programs within the National Wildlife Refuge System through 2027. That bill was passed the House in September 2022. And there is also the Refuge System Protection Act, which was introduced in both the 117th and the 118th Congress. This would give Fish and Wildlife Service the ability to collect civil damages to fund repair of damaged refuge resources. And this would be a big help because currently they can only collect criminal penalties, and those monies get sent to a general fund. And I think they have to submit the request to OMB to get the funding for repairs for incidents that happened on site, and that funding could potentially be to the detriment of other refuge projects. So the idea is to keep the funding on site to help with the repairs on site. So that's something that we're still working on. We're gonna hopefully we'll try to get that passed on the Senate side soon. So there's more to come on that. Hopefully this year we'll keep everyone updated. And so those are just a couple examples of how the caucus can work together to develop legislative solutions to a variety of issues. And we look forward to keeping that effort going throughout the year and for many more years to come. So that's it for me. Just want to say thanks again for your interest, and please let me know if you or someone or a member that you know of would be interested in joining the caucus, and I'll be happy to help them out with that. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. And yes, I want to reiterate, if your boss is not a member of the Congressional Wildlife Refuge Caucus yet, please consider having them join. It is a House only caucus, but it's bipartisan and growing. So please present that to your boss. All right, I'd like to pass it on to Cynthia Martinez, Chief of the National Wildlife Refuge System.
Thanks, Libby. Really appreciate that. And thank you, Brian. Thank you for all of that support. Thanks to the National Wildlife Refuge Association and for CARE for putting together this briefing, and along with the Refuge Caucus. Congressman Thompson's been a great supporter and I might add fan to the refuge system and working really hard with him and Congressman Whitman, certainly as early co-chairs for this caucus. I appreciate the new co-chairs that we have and each of the other members as well. And I appreciate everybody that is joining us today for this briefing. So we'll go ahead and move on past this first slide. And I'll start by introducing you to the National Wildlife Refuge System and tell you why these places are special places where wildlife and people thrive. I'm also going to cover the challenges that are ahead, and I'm going to close by sharing how we can invest in resiliency for the future of wildlife and people. Wildlife refuges are an integral part of America's best idea to preserve and conserve our natural resources for future generations. The National Wildlife Refuge System began in 1903 when President Theodore Roosevelt established Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge in Florida. And that was at the urging of the community to save the last brown pelican rookery on the East Coast. You see, Pelican Island was just a 5-acre refuge that launched what is now a robust system of lands and waters dedicated to wildlife conservation for the benefit of the American people, as well as providing continual access to recreation across the country. National wildlife refuges are distinct from other public lands in their purpose and in the way they are established. Conserving wildlife, it guides everything that occurs on refuges, starting with the purposes for which each refuge is established, to the recreational activities offered, to the resource management tools used. You can see our special purpose in what we do. We deploy a host of scientifically sound management tools to address wildlife conservation challenges, from species interventions to land acquisition. For example, the National Wildlife Refuge System is the only federal land management agency that can quickly react to species habitat needs, such as from the impacts of climate change. And we are the only federal agency that can establish new refuges or expand existing refuges to meet those needs. There are two ways a refuge system unit may be established. One is by you all, legislatively by Congress, or secondly, administratively by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Director. The president used to have the authority to establish refuge system units, but no longer does. Essential to both wildlife and people, the National Wildlife Refuge System provides crucial habitats for our nation's abundant wildlife, nearby nature for local communities, and a frontline defense against climate impacts, ensuring a resilient future. Why are these places so essential? Because the lands and waters of the refuge system are vast. There is at least one refuge in all 50 states and 5 territories. And so here's just a picture of the United States with some inserts of Alaskan honeymoon. So let's try to walk through this. I might need your imagination a little bit. But if you start east of Florida, east of Puerto Rico, in the U.S. Virgin Islands, we have 3 national wildlife. If you go north to the coast of Maine and on up to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, come back down, not just to the Northwest, not that the Northwest isn't important, but we go beyond that. Let's go to the next slide to help illustrate this. We go past Hawaii, all the way past Guam, all the way to the Northern Mariana Islands. You see, we have refuges that go from the Mariana Islands, and then if you go south, past the equator, that's Rosa Atoll at the very bottom. Let's go to the next slide. You see, we have national wildlife refuges from one end of the coast to the other end of the coast, all the way to Mariana Island. The refuge system marine waters extend from above the Arctic Circle along that north shore of Alaska to the depths of the Mariana Trench, and even to those pristine reefs south of the equator at Rosy Cole that I had discussed. We have 5 marine national monuments, those 4 in the Pacific, and then the one in the Northeast Canadian Seamounts in the Atlantic. So as you can see, refuges protect nearly every type of marine and coastal habitat, including rocky shorelines, mudflats, seagrass beds, salt marshes, mangroves, corals, underground canyons, seamounts, and hydrothermal beds, among many other unique habitats. This includes protecting 72% of the coral in U.S. waters. The vast 760 million acres of marine and coastal areas are protected within the refuge system. This includes 181 coastal refuges, 5 marine monuments comprising nearly 1/4 of the U.S. exclusive economic zone, or the EEZ. These areas are vitally important to ensuring the viability of marine wildlife and fisheries today and the future, as well as providing important blue carbon storage. Grasslands are another key ecosystem conserved within the refuge system and with our partners. This habitat is important for songbirds and pollinators that are vitally important to farmers and ranchers, and are a valuable ecosystem for capturing and holding carbon from the atmosphere. We are responsible for an average of 50,000 of the prescribed fires within the Department of the Interior. Prescribed fire helps improve habitat and biodiversity, and it reduces fire risk on refuges and in nearby communities. Also, in collaboration with nearby private landowners, our Partners for Fish and Wildlife program is awarding bipartisan infrastructure law bill funds to reduce unwanted vegetation on private lands, to reduce wildfire risk and invasive species. Those funds are expected to support treatment on about 94,000 acres. These participating landowners continue to own and manage their land while they help reduce wildfire risk and improve conditions for wildlife. On wetlands, we protect migratory birds and waterfowl. These areas also act as natural flood barriers, buffers, and water purifiers. All of these ecosystems safeguard our country's biodiversity, providing ecosystem services like clean air and water, which are vital for all life. The biodiversity includes the range of species which occur on wildlife refuges. You see the numbers on the slide. Additionally, 350 threatened and endangered species like the black-footed ferret, California condor, and green sea turtle. We deploy innovative strategies to restore populations, combat invasive species, and support fish and wildlife health. So, for example, because of years of translocation work and collaboration with many partners, the first ever black-footed albatross nest was established at James Campbell National Wildlife Refuge in Hawaii in November 2023. As a variety of threats to native wildlife continue to emerge, such as highly pathogenic avian influenza, restoring populations is critical to species conservation. With an emphasis on the health of animals, people, and the environment, we support education, training, and response to mitigate disease, limit impact, and prevent future occurrences. Now, unfortunately, our innovation can only take us so far. We are still concerned about what we can't track when it comes to biodiversity loss and wildlife's vulnerability to climate hazards. So, for example, only 27% of our documented threatened and endangered species are monitored, which potentially leads to more species loss through the inability to manage invasive plants and animals. For example, 95 refuges have feral hog populations, with some impacting upland birds and sea turtles. our vulnerability to climate hazards, we have almost 67% of refuge units need a comprehensive conservation plan. That's our management plan that tells us how we're going to manage each unit of the refuge system. Or they're in need to update that plan, which is more than 15 years old, which is severely limiting landscape level planning for wildlife, fish, and plant species, or their adaptability to changing conditions. To address these concerns and threats, we're prioritizing nature-based solutions that can deliver dividends for wildlife and people and tackle challenges through climate resiliency. Nature-based solutions protect fish and wildlife service administered public lands and infrastructure and neighboring communities from extreme weather events and natural disasters like floods and droughts and wildfire. This pairs well with our community-focused conservation approach that we have been piloting through our urban wildlife conservation program. We are steering wildlife conservation in the 21st century towards benefits for both wildlife and local communities, ensuring access for all and enhancing climate resilience. So, for example, we are lowering flood and fire risk and the impacts of droughts for the refuge and neighboring communities around Great Dismal Swamp National Wildlife Refuge by restoring water flow to retain carbon-rich peat soils. Another example is McFadden and Texas Point National Wildlife Refuges in Texas, providing both benefits to wildlife and protecting the communities surrounding and supporting local oil refineries. These refuges will hold back floodwaters and protect the billions of dollars of oil industry that has a significant impact on the U.S. economy, as well as preventing natural disasters from creating contaminants disasters if the refineries were destroyed. On the shores of Silicon Valley, near Meta's headquarters, Don Edwards San Francisco Bay National Wildlife Refuge collaborates with various partners to convert industrial salt ponds into tidal marshes. This project enhances wildlife habitats and has already averted 500-year flood events in neighboring communities. Don Edwards San Francisco Bay National Wildlife Refuge exemplifies how wildlife refuges serve as gateways to nature for neighboring communities. While some refuges are tourism destinations, most provide open space and recreation opportunities, which fosters a strong community connection. So while I focus on 4 refuges in the last 4 slides, nearly all of the units in the refuge system provide multiple benefits to local communities and local, state, and national economic activities. The National Wildlife Refuge System Improvement Act of 1997 identifies 6 priority recreational uses, such as hunting, fishing, wildlife observation and photography, and environmental education and interpretation. These activities are priorities on every refuge if they're found compatible with the refuge's statutory purpose and include many forms of enjoying the outdoors. Some people enjoy simply taking a walk with friends and family. Others prefer fishing, biking, or bird watching, and that really makes refuges true community assets. Refuge recreation generates approximately $3.2 billion in local and state economic activity each year. Now, the Fish and Wildlife Service has been identified as what's called a high impact service provider, and that is due to the millions of visitors for National Wildlife Refuge. We strive for a positive and equitable visitor experience, trying to ensure high customer satisfaction by enhancing recreational trip planning through improved websites and digital passes in line with the 21st Century Integrated Digital Experience Act idea. Operating visitor centers to assist and prepare visitors for outdoor experiences, improving signage for better navigation, providing accessible trails, viewing blinds, and recreational features by using low recreation fees and other leverage dollars like our transportation funds for improvements, and those come from the federal highways bill. Monitoring visitor satisfaction through national surveys conducted every 5 years at refuges with over 50,000 annual visitors. It's important to note that we are serving communities and wildlife with reduced numbers of employees and volunteers. And so what you're looking at here is the dark blue bars represent full-time employees, and it starts on the left with fiscal year 11 and it ends in fiscal year 23. What you see is that there's been a 28% decrease in our workforce since 2011. Additionally, and in correlation with, we have experienced a reduction in volunteer hours served despite adding additional refuges and acres and serving more visitors. You see the increase in visitation of 34%. We are seeing the impacts of these trends in the visitor experience. Nearly all of our 125 visitor centers operate with either limited hours, only volunteer staffing, or are completely closed. Many, if not all, these facilities depend on interns and volunteers, and that can lead to safety issues without staff oversight. In addition, 7 states, and that's 45 stations, lack federal wildlife officers, and that leads to significantly delayed response. But there are some bright spots thanks to our partners in our collaborative approach to conservation. We work with a diverse group of local and national partners to ensure for benefits for both wildlife and local communities, ensuring access for all and enhancing climate resilience. Those are the numbers of our friends groups and our partners. We have further established community conservation and improved access to outdoor recreation through the Urban Wildlife Conservation Program, which was established in 2011. This program, it improves community access to green spaces and ensures inclusion in conservation efforts and in near major cities, benefiting the 80% of Americans living in urban areas. We have made targeted investments at 8 flagship sites, 32 urban partnerships, 31 urban bird treaty cities, and through community engagement fellows at multiple sites. The program emphasizes building strong, meaningful relationships with diverse communities to achieve equitable conservation outcomes, promoting innovation, and a community-focused approach to conservation. Despite our efforts to ensure positive and equitable visitor and community engagement, the infrastructure supporting both people and wildlife is continuously degrading. While we address identified deficiencies, new ones inevitably arise, highlighting the need for ongoing maintenance and investment. To maintain our portfolio of over 40,000 assets valued at $61 billion, the Fish and Wildlife Service receives $170 million annually. While industry standards suggest investing 2 to 4% of the current replacement value, or CRV, annually for maintenance, strategic prioritization allows us to sustain acceptable conditions with just 1.3% of CRV. However, our deferred maintenance backlog stands at $2.9 billion in the service and $2.5 billion in the refuge system, and it could exceed $27 billion in the service by 2050 without proper life cycle investment. Now, Fish and Wildlife Service uses its dollars efficiently by prioritizing a life cycle maintenance approach to infrastructure. We utilize maintenance action teams and schedule maintenance to renew and extend the life of existing assets, which can save 40 to 400% in costs if supported through life cycle investment appropriation. The Fish and Wildlife Service reduced our deferred maintenance backlog by 50% between 2011 and 2018 through refined business practices, naturally consistent procedures, and disposal of non-mission essential assets. But since then, our backlog, it has quickly returned to 2011 levels due to the aging infrastructure and the unparalleled inflationary increases in the construction market. The refuge system deferred maintenance backlog of $2.5 billion at the end of 23 is growing by about 18% per year. Most of our infrastructure is past the end of their maximum useful lifespan. And without sufficient funding, there are multiple challenges maintaining the inventory into acceptable condition to support safe working conditions, housing, and outdoor recreational opportunities. To overcome some of these challenges, Fish and Wildlife Service is actively leveraging hundreds of millions of much needed Inflation Reduction Act, Great American Outdoors Act, bipartisan infrastructure law funds to deploy nature-based solutions. The Fish and Wildlife Service received $125 million from the IRA to enhance climate resilience across the National Wildlife Refuge System and state wildlife management areas. These funds support a wide range of large-scale projects, from restoring coastal areas in North Carolina, promoting climate resilience forests in the northern states, to conserve the prairie pothole region and improve grasslands for bison. $48 million in build funding is going to help cap orphaned oil and gas wells at refuges across North Dakota, West Virginia, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and Texas. And so far, half of the 339 wells have been capped, ensuring safety for wildlife and people. Build funds are supporting removing physical and environmental hazards at 6 refuges, improving health and safety for wildlife and visitors. Some of those examples include closing a mine shaft at Sedieta National Wildlife Refuge in New Mexico and revegetating mined areas at Rocky Flats National Wildlife Refuge in Colorado. In closing, we all know the value of our refuges. It's not just about conservation. It's about rallying behind something we all believe in. Our refuges are a good public investment, economically and recreationally. They're not just patches of land, they're economic drivers, providing recreational opportunities that benefit local communities. So, as we envision a future where the National Wildlife Refuge System not only survives, but thrives, remember, this work is about the countless Americans who find solace, recreation, and connection in these vast landscapes. With your support, we can continue to build on our success, ensuring that America's wildlife refuges remain a place where we all thrive. Thank you very much. Back to you, Libby.
Great, thanks, Cynthia. And as a reminder to folks, if you have any questions for our panelists, please put them in the Q&A function and we will take a look at them at the end. All right, let's pass it on to Christian Hunt with Defenders of Wildlife.
All right, bear with me as I pull up my screen. Okay. Hey folks, my name is Christian Hunt, work for Defenders of Wildlife. Appreciate you guys taking the time today to learn more about the refuge system, something we all care about deeply. I'm going to talk about the system's importance to American biodiversity. And one thing I like to start off with these sort of presentations is just acknowledging the fact up front that the refuge system is really unique for a variety of reasons, one of which is that more than any other federal land system, it really bears its mission in its name. The refuge system is truly the one place in this country where wildlife always comes first. You know, this is the system where the red wolf, Florida panther, California condor, you name it, all those species are prioritized. And in that sense, I really think the refuge system is utterly unique, both in this country and the world over. And really, it represents I think, one of our most selfless ideas yet, and it deserves all the resources we can give it, as Cynthia described. But of course, again, it began with brown pelicans of all species. This is an animal I think we all sometimes can take for granted because it's common. But the reason it's common is partly due to the protections it was afforded through the refuge system. And it began when, of course, President Teddy Roosevelt established Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge, which was the first refuge. And since then, the refuge system has grown by leaps and bounds. We now have close to 600 national wildlife refuges in all 50 states. And the refuge system is also really unique because of its wide distribution. There are refuges within an hour's drive of every single major metropolitan city in this country. So it's really a uniquely accessible system in a way that perhaps national parks and other federal lands are not. It's also, just from a sheer habitat perspective, the most diverse that we have in this country. It goes without saying that wildlife needs habitat to survive. It needs habitat to recover, which is why in the refuge system you have not only mountainous landscapes, but you've got tropical forests, you've got prairies, tundra, shoreline, swamp, you name it. And that really is another thing that sets this system apart, is its ability to capture the wide diversity of habitats that we are fortunate to have in this country. Now, as is usually the case for all federal lands, the refuges are simply bigger in Alaska. So much so that Alaska has about 4% of all refuge units, yet over 80% of the refuge system's land acreage. So you've got some very large refuges up there, such as Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and Eisenbeck National Wildlife Refuge, among others. Yet, despite this sort of Alaskan lopsidedness, if you will, the system still supports 1/3 of all federally listed species. That is, species protected under the Endangered Species Act, which really highlights the disproportionate importance of the refuge system to imperiled wildlife. If we are serious about recovering endangered wildlife in this country, we have to be serious about protecting and fully funding the refuge system. And to that end, an important mechanism is continuing to grow refuges, because the system is also unique in that refuges are regularly established for individual listed species. One of which, pictured here, is the Florida manatee. This photo was taken at Crystal River National Wildlife Refuge in Florida, which is just a stunning refuge. It's got these turquoise waters, and on any given day, you can go down there and see dozens of manatees, and you can really see the refuge system in action for wildlife in a really meaningful way. Another refuge set aside for listed species was Ash Meadows. There are dozens of imperiled species in Ash Meadows, and it has roughly 24 species found nowhere else in the world. So, this is one of the crown jewels of the refuge system, to be sure, and is another great example of how nimble and effective the refuge system can be at protecting imperiled wildlife. But refuges are not parks. National parks are governed by a different mandate, of course. People sometimes nonetheless confuse refuges and parks. But when you look at the history, parks are by and large established to protect outstanding features. Say Old Faithful in Yellowstone, for instance. They're often set aside to preserve scenic vistas. Refuges, of course, have great scenery, but some refuges are arguably not that scenic. And, one example of this is Monte Vista in Colorado, pictured here. Of course, has a mountainous backdrop. And when you go out onto the land and look at your feet, it might not produce a wow factor. But when you take the time to learn about this refuge, why it was set aside, where it was set aside, and what it's designed to accomplish, you really appreciate it so much more and come away with a much deeper understanding for these places. And Monte Vista, for example, hosts tens of thousands of sandhill cranes during their migration north. In fact, roughly 90% of the entire Rocky Mountain population relies on Monte Vista during that migration, which again, just, this one site is providing immense value to this one species, and is another great example of how the refuge system is strategically grown to accommodate and provide sanctuary for target species. Now, there are some very, very large and extraordinarily scenic refuges in the refuge system, one of which is the Desert National Wildlife Refuge, which at 1.6 million acres is quite large. Another is Okefenokee in Georgia and Florida, which protects North America's largest blackwater wetland. In places like this, in some of these really large sort of ecosystem scale refuges, all that's required is a very light management touch. The Fish and Wildlife Service doesn't need to do a lot because these landscapes were protected early on and have not been diminished. For the majority of the system, however, management is required. And one of the things that I really deeply value about the refuge system is that when refuges are managed properly, over time, they should get better and better and better. They should provide better wildlife habitat over time. So there's a lot of promise in the refuge system. And I think a phenomenal example of this is St. Mark's in Florida. The land you're looking at here was once completely denuded. St. Mark's was a moonscape when the Fish and Wildlife Service acquired it, but they saw potential, and over time they brought the land back to life. And as a result, St. Mark's is now one of the most biodiverse refuges in the country. It's one of 3 breeding sites for frosted flatwoods salamanders, and it also has red-cockaded woodpeckers, among other imperiled species. And another fantastic example of management in action by the Fish and Wildlife Service is Rocky Mountain Arsenal in Colorado. This was actually a former chemical munitions facility where that bison is standing. So during World War II, mustard gas, sarin gas, some of the most noxious chemicals known to man were being produced on this tract. But over time, it was rehabilitated. It was brought back to life. And now just outside the Denver skyline, you have bison, you've got imperiled black-footed ferrets, you've got easy access for thousands of nature-hungry people from Denver. So again, the refuge system really has a lot of promise and potential for wildlife. But it is struggling. It is, I would argue, in fact, starving for resources right now. The Fish and Wildlife Service cannot adequately fulfill the promise set forward for the refuge system by Congress, I would argue, without increased funding. It needs more staff, it needs more resources, and it needs more attention moving forward, which is why I certainly appreciate everybody joining today's call. I'm sure everyone else does as well, and we hope to partner with you more moving forward. And with that, I will hand it off to Ian. Thank you all.
Thanks so much, Christian. Let me get this going. Sure. All right, can everybody see the PowerPoint? I'll take that as a yes. All right. Hey, everybody. I'm Ian Nakayama. I'm the Government Relations Manager at the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, and I'm here today to talk a little bit about outdoor recreation in the National Wildlife Refuge System. So the National Wildlife Refuge System, abbreviated in my PowerPoint as NWRS, is the only network of federal lands and waters dedicated to fish and wildlife conservation. More than 570 refuges comprise the National Wildlife Refuge System that spans some 95 million acres. The primary objective for refuges is to conserve, restore, and enhance fish, wildlife, and their habitats. But these lands are not off limits to other uses, including recreational uses, so long as they do not interfere with these key goals. The National Wildlife Refuge System provides some of the only publicly accessible federal land in the non-Western United States. As Christian mentioned, the National Wildlife Refuge System has great geographic diversity. So if you look at a map of all of the federal land management agencies, public federal lands, the vast majority are located in the West. But if you look at the map that is on the right side of this PowerPoint slide, you'll see the distribution of National Wildlife Refuge Systems, and they're all over the country. So for many folks, these refuges may be their only interaction with federal lands in their day-to-day life. This geographic distribution is also essential for hunters and anglers in parts of the country where the vast majority of land is privately owned. For those who don't have the means or connections to get a hunting lease, National Wildlife Refuges may be their only accessible hunting area. And with over 67 million annual visits, the National Wildlife Refuge System is one of the most popular federal land management agencies for outdoor recreation. The National Wildlife Refuge System is managed with multiple priority public uses for wildlife-related activities. These are hunting, fishing, photography, wildlife watching, environmental education, and interpretation. You might hear the term wildlife refuge and be confused about the allowance of the hunting and fishing part. I mean, it's supposed to be a refuge for wildlife. Well, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service explicitly states that national wildlife refuges exist primarily to safeguard wildlife populations through habitat preservation. The word refuge includes the idea of providing a haven of safety for wildlife, and as such, hunting might seem like an inconsistent use of the National Wildlife Refuge System. However, habitat that normally supports healthy wildlife populations produces harvestable surpluses that are a renewable resource. By law, hunting and fishing on refuges is closed to the public unless otherwise opened as a priority public use by the Secretary of Interior. So as you might imagine, there are a few one-size-fits-all approaches to management of over 570 refuges and 70 fish hatcheries, which is why hunting and fishing regulations on these public lands are diverse. Some units do not allow hunting at all. Some units are only open for certain species of game. Only portions of a refuge may be open for some species, while others may be hunted on every acre, except in specific safety zones. When, where, and how hunting or fishing is allowed is dependent on several factors, and the decision to permit these activities is made on a case-by-case and unit-by-unit basis by local refuge managers and biologists. Considerations include the purpose and objectives of each refuge or hatchery, its biological soundness, and the public demand for and economic feasibility of providing recreation while protecting other resources. Plus, there are legal requirements depending on how a refuge was established. For example, refuges established as migratory bird sanctuaries may allow hunting of migratory waterfowl on no more than 40% of the refuge acreage. Many national wildlife refuges purchase land with money from federal duck stamp sales. Duck stamps are legally required to be purchased by any waterfowl hunter in the United States, so many national wildlife refuges that focus around migratory birds were established with funding and help from hunters and anglers. Now, the National Wildlife Refuge System has over 42 million birders and wildlife observers annually, 2 million nature program attendees, 2.5 million annual hunting visits, 8.5 million annual fishing visits, and over 2,100 miles of public walking trails and boardwalks. I'd highly recommend everybody on this call going to the closest wildlife refuge to you if you get the chance. My favorite ones that are day trippable from the DC area are the Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge in Maryland and the Rappahannock River Valley Wildlife Refuge in Virginia. Finally, I wanted to talk about what the sporting community sees as one of the greatest challenges, especially funding challenges in the National Wildlife Refuge System currently. As Cynthia talked about briefly, out-of-date comprehensive conservation plans, or CCPs for short, are essentially CCPs are essentially a master plan for fish and wildlife management, recreation, and administration at each wildlife refuge. They are extensive documents. Many contain over 1,000 pages in total. As Cynthia mentioned, over 60% of wildlife refuges have out-of-date comprehensive conservation plans. That backlog is detrimental to wildlife management and recreational opportunities, and it is caused by a lack of funding for staff capacity. CCPs dictate each National Wildlife Refuge's management for the next 15 years. They are bottom-up, citizen-centered government at its best. So when they're crafting each CCP, they work with public participation and input as central tenets. They reach out to local communities. They reach out to volunteers in these friends groups, Friends of National Wildlife Refuges, that help provide a lot of the volunteer man hours to maintain these National Wildlife Refuges. They work with state conservation agencies, and they work with partners, as diverse as the National Rifle Association and Defenders of Wildlife to help guide refuge management through the development of each CCP. So under the National Wildlife Refuge System Improvement Act of 1997, CCPs are legally required to be updated every 15 years, but their current staffing levels make keeping up to date with that 15-year requirement essentially impossible. The number of refuges has gone up over time, but there are less planning staff now than there were 15 years ago, even though the number of refuges have increased. And these CCPs are essential for expanding access to outdoor recreation. They identify areas compatible with hunting and fishing and are required for expanding hunting and fishing opportunities on national wildlife refuges. And the only solution that at least the sporting community sees for this is increased funding for the National Wildlife Refuge System. There are other problems we see with lack of funding. Sometimes hunting and fishing opportunities will be closed, or especially hunting opportunities might be closed to the public if there aren't enough staff to safely manage the National Wildlife Refuge System, enough staff to safely manage the hunt that is currently occurring. So those are just some of the benefits of the National Wildlife Refuge System and then some of the challenges currently faced to the sporting community by the current lack of funding. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ian. Well, we're basically at the top of the hour and I have not seen any questions come in. So for folks who need to go, I'll just give a really quick closing and some of us can stay on afterwards for anybody who has lingering questions. But I really want to thank everybody for joining today. Hopefully you took away from this the values of the refuge system, not just for wildlife, but for communities as well. And a sense of just how dire the funding and staffing situation is and how that's impacting refuges across the country. So after this briefing, as I mentioned, I will send this recording out. I believe I'll be able to send our slide presentations as well. And I'll be sending some fact sheets that go into some detail about some more specifics about the funding needs for the refuge system. For folks who need to go, I understand, but anyone who has questions, feel free to stay on. Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it. Okay, we do have one question. At the beginning, you mentioned how much funding you wanted through the FY25 budget. What was the amount? So CARE is asking in FY25 for at least $602.3 million for the National Wildlife Refuge System operations and maintenance account. But we're recognizing that the full need really is closer to 2.2 billion. So we believe that the 602.3 million is a very much needed step towards that goal. And those kind of increments need to be made every year on out. Current funding levels for FY24 sit at 527 million. So just to give you a sense of the amount of increase that we're looking at. Okay, I see no more questions. So again, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. I'm happy to answer anything or email any of these folks on the panel today. All right, thank you, everybody.